Well, today is March 3rd, 2022, and I'm Gordon Jones with the Atlanta History Center in Atlanta, Georgia. And I'm talking with Len Traynor of New South Wales, Wentworthville, and we are sitting in his famous library. We have known each other for, 20 some odd years?
Since 1996, Gordon.
Since 1996.
26 years.
And I have known Len as a great friend and one of the greatest civil warriors that I have ever met.
Thank you.
And so what we were going to do today is just to talk a little bit about your career as a civil warrior and how you became interested in the American Civil War and your life history. So let me just start by asking you this. So, Len, where were you born? How did you get your first interest in the Civil War? Wasn't it a family thing for you?
Yes, it was. Where I was born at home in Jennings Street, Matraville, on the 9th of January, 1937. And we moved to a suburb called Kingsford during the war years. And I remember it very clearly. I was sitting in the bath one evening while my father was shaving, and he was singing a song, Sherman Stashing Yankee Boys. And I asked him about it, and he told me the story, because his father was a Civil War enthusiast, because his uncle had fought in the Civil War. And his father was a great Civil War enthusiast, and for some reason that struck a spark in me, and I became fascinated with it, and have done for the last 77 years.
Right, so you had the two ancestors from Ireland.
Yes, one came here, and the other one went to the United States and fought in the Irish Brigade.
Right. And then you also had your grandfather who was such an enthusiast that he came to Sydney especially to see the cyclorama.
He travelled 150 miles from out west just to see the cyclorama.
Yeah, tell us about that and his interest.
Well, the little that I know, because my father, he was the youngest of 11 good Irish Catholics, and his father died when he was 9, so he didn't get much information, although he remembers his father singing Yankee songs and wearing a little blue Yankee cap around the house sometimes.
Did that Yankee cap make it?
God knows where it is at the moment. I'd like to know.
Right, right. But, I mean, obviously there's a lot of interest in the American Civil War in Australia, or else they wouldn't have brought the cyclorama here.
Gordon, not at that time.
Yeah?
And I was interested, but where did I get information? School libraries didn't have much, local libraries didn't have much. But I used to go and see all the films, Died with Their Boots On, Springfield Rifle, Drums in the Deep South, Gone with the Wind, of course. And it wasn't until I left school in 1951 that when I started I could move around into the city and visit second-hand bookshops and new bookshops to get Civil War books on my limited budget.
All right. But there were Civil War veterans who settled here in Australia.
Yes, there was a lot of Civil War veterans. The count so far was over 200. 200
Civil War veterans
more
settled
yes.
From both sides.
Yes.
And so there were maybe some things that were here, but for most kids growing up your age,
knew nothing about the
Civil War.
Knew
nothing at all.
And they didn't talk about it anyhow.
Right.
Because World War II was on.
Right.
And other things to occupy their minds.
So you're going to the secondhand bookshops and you're watching the movies.
Yes.
You've got your sort of a family background with this.
Support from my father, but none from my mother, who thought it was a waste of time and effort.
Right. She didn't care for old things, but you did.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I love Civil War.
And so now, do you remember your first Civil War book?
Lincoln's Contemporaries, which is on the shelf there.
And how old were you when you got
15. It cost me 30 shillings, which was half a week's wages. And I had to send to America for it, and it took 4 months to come.
You must have been very excited to receive it.
Yes, and then I got my second Civil War book, was Hallowed Ground by Bruce Catton.
The Bruce Catton.
And then I used to haunt the libraries after school or after work. I'd go to the libraries and look at their Civil War books, and they had some. And if a library had 60 books, I was just absolutely fascinated. And also the American consulate in Sydney had a reference library. And I used to spend up to 9 o'clock at night in there reading their Civil War books.
So they must have gotten to know you on a first-name basis.
Yeah, they did actually, yeah.
Yeah, here comes that kid.
Yeah, here comes that nuisance again.
Yeah, that's right. Well, so but you must have also been a voracious reader.
Well, I'd like to think I am,
Yeah,
because I always like reading.
You're a fast reader, though.
I'm not so sure about that.
Well, you certainly remember everything you've read, though.
No, not everything I read. I'd like to. That's when I'd like to have the memory when I remember everything I read, but I haven't reached that status yet.
Well, I think you got pretty close, because I'm going to ask you about your first trip to America and the game show. You obviously had to remember a great deal about the Civil War for that.
Yeah, more good luck than good management.
Well, how did that? Tell us that story.
It was a television program, a quiz called Cole's 6,000. And at first it was £3,000, and when we went decimal currency, it became $6,000, which was a lot of money in 1966. And it was unique that the contestant could choose their own subject. And one of my work colleagues said to me, why don't you apply to go on Cole's quiz? And I said, I don't know enough. And he said, at least you get a trip to Melbourne. And the prizes were, as you answered the questions, you went up and went up. And the one that I was wanting was the 2 weeks, all expenses paid at Sahara Hotel in Las Vegas. But I'm not a gambler. But Las Vegas was close to the Civil War battlefields in Sydney. And the next prize was a brand new motor car. And the top prize was the £6,000 or £3,000. I wasn't interested. I didn't drive, and if I won the big money, my first wife would have taken me to cleaners for child maintenance, but they couldn't take the trip away from me. And I aimed for that. And I went through and did an audition, and then I had to fly to Melbourne and appear on the television program.
And so what were the what happened after that? What were the questions that they were giving to you?
Well, they say to you, if we ask you a question and you give an answer, and we say you're wrong, and you prove later to us you're right, we'll bring you back on the show. But don't argue on camera. And you go out, and it was in an old picture theatre with seating 2,000 people. You've got lights, cameras, and experts all around the country sitting in their lounge chairs just wanting to see whether you succeed or fail. And the first question, I did the audition, 30 questions, and I found out later that I'd got 100%, which was the worst thing I could have done, because they asked me very hard questions. And the first question was, who did General Lee relieve as General-in-Chief of the Confederate Army? And I said he didn't relieve anyone. He was the first and only one appointed. And they said, that's not the answer we have. And I said, well, your answer's wrong. Oh, dear. The audience went ballistic, you can imagine. I've done it now. And I said, you've probably got General Johnson. And he said, yes. I said, well, I told you it was wrong. And the audience went off again like mad. And I thought, oh, God, there's this little know-all appearing on camera. So he stopped and he said, you appear to know the subject, you explained to me, which I did, and they accepted it. And when we had a break in filming, I said to the compere, I'm sorry, he said, made good television.
Good television,
yeah.
That's what. So then you went on, and I think one of the things that this is the one that you stumped me on, but the question that they asked you was about the ships at Island Number 10,
yeah,
is that right?
The ironclad instrumental in the capture of Island Number 10.
Which was?
And I said it was either the Baron de Kalb or the Carondelet, and that was a great question.
Yeah. See, because the thing that I noticed about you, you have such great recall. You can recall all these facts and figures and statistics. You have almost a photographic memory for these things. So I'm going to imagine that you were perfect for that game show.
Well, it's pretty testing because you've got a lot of stress on you. You've got the live audience, you've got the cameras and the lights, and you've got money or big prizes, and you only got 15 seconds to answer.
Right.
And easy questions if you know the answer. They're hard questions if you don't know the answer. Simple as that. And I was lucky they asked me questions I knew the answer.
Fair enough. But now at this time, what are you doing for a real job at this time?
I was working at my trade.
Which was?
Painting and decorating, which I hated.
And then were you also fencing?
I started that in 1954.
Right. So tell us about that. So you're you have a whole story about you have a whole career is in competition fencing.
Oh, I spent 20 years.
And
during World War II, I watched The Mark of Zorro, 1940, with Tyrone Power and Basil Rathbone. And there's a magnificent fencing scene in that, in my opinion, the best one ever put to screen. And that struck a fire in me when I was about 7. And I thought, one day I'd like to learn that. And I always thought about it. And when I left school, and in 51, then I started work in 52, and I thought, gee, I'd like to do fencing. So I looked in the phone book and saw the fencing club was listed, and I went down to see one. And I was told that I was too short, I'd never be any good as a swordsman. But I persevered and proved them wrong.
And do I not recall that you were selected for the Commonwealth Games in 1958?
Well,
yes.
I fenced foil for 2 years, which didn't suit my personality, and they swapped me to sabre, and I love sabre.
And you were the Australian national champion in 1962.
I won competitions, I won state titles, and I won selection for the Commonwealth Games in 62.
So you have this background in fencing.
Yeah.
And you're working.
Yeah.
And then you go on to this game show. I mean, did your friends think you were nuts or what?
I didn't tell anybody.
But didn't they see you on the game show?
Didn't even tell my family. And the first they thought of me was appearing on television.
Right. So what? So let's finish the story on the game show. So what happens?
Well, I won the trip to America.
And you turned down the new car.
Well, I didn't want to go that further.
Right.
Although they did ask me the question, but I wasn't interested because I got what I wanted.
Right.
And I didn't know the answer anyhow.
So
it didn't really matter.
So 1967, you get the trip to the United States.
67, yes.
67, right? And so
I spent 2 weeks in Vegas.
Right.
Didn't gamble.
Well, that was the obligatory 2 weeks.
Yes, that was part of the prize.
Right, but then you decided to make more out of that
and
trip.
Then I had a 5-year visa and a work permit.
So what'd you do?
I travelled to the East Coast.
And
I got a job over there and travelled around visiting Civil War battlefields and museums and buying the books I could afford.
So you spent how long on that first trip?
6 months.
6 months
I
in
had
the United
5
States.
years, but I didn't want to be away from my daughter for 5 years.
Sure. But you managed to cover a lot of ground in that 6 months.
I did.
And I think at one point you were even asked to stay on for a couple of job opportunities.
Well,
right?
I was offered a sporting scholarship at one of the universities.
For fencing?
Yep, fencing. A 4-year scholarship. And I said, well, what sort of discipline would I do? And they said, well, what are you interested in? And I said, Civil War. And they said, well, you can get a 4-year course, you get a degree in American Civil War. And I thought, well, that won't get me a job back in Sydney. And then apart from that, I didn't want to be away from my daughter for 4 years.
Sure.
So I turned it down.
Yeah, I think you were also, you walked into a rehearsal of a production in New York City, right?
Yes.
Tell us about that one.
I don't want to name drop, but I was walking through Manhattan, strolling casually, and a taxi pulled up and 2 fellows got out carrying rapiers, and they disappeared into a rehearsal hall. And I said, that's interesting. I followed them in, and it was the National Shakespearean Company, I think, and they were doing rehearsals for Romeo and Juliet. And I was watching the sword play, and I thought, these people don't know what they're doing, haven't got the faintest idea. So when they had a break, I got talking to them and started to show them a few movements and everything else. And the fella came over, he said, I'm the stage manager. He said, we'd like to engage you as our fencing master. And I said, well, I can't accept it because that'll infringe my amateur status. But I will spend time after work and weekends and teach your actors fencing, teach them how to fence, and choreography the duels, which I did do. And I fenced at the various fencing club in New York Fencing Club, the New York Jewish Club, Costello's Fencing Club.
You could have had a job in Hollywood.
Yeah, well, that was offered to me.
Yeah. But meanwhile, you're also Australian accent is getting you all sorts of special
I don't have an
access.
Australian accent.
Oh, excuse me. Yeah. You're non-American. The fact that you don't sound like me was getting you into some pretty special places during that.
Well, there was a bit of an open sesame.
Yeah.
Coupled with my innocence.
Right. So you were getting access into some of the best Civil War collections.
It did help.
In America.
Yes. The Confederate Museum, for one.
And I think that was where you were managing, you got to handle, what was it?
A few items of great interest.
Such as?
Oh, lots of things.
Well, tell me. Come on, don't keep us waiting.
General Lee's frock coat, his gauntlets, his sword, his revolver, his hat, the pen that he used to sign the surrender.
Ah, that's what I'm talking about.
Things like that.
And I think you were also at the New York Historical Society, right?
Yes, I went there.
Yeah, and they kind of let you just...
Spent 3 days examining their uniforms.
Without supervision.
Yep. Which was very kind and gracious of them.
You can't do that today,
No, well, I didn't violate the trust.
That's right. That's right. And so now you come home in what? Then that would have been 1968 when you went back.
And I came home in late 1967, December, just before Christmas.
Right. So then you return.
I didn't go back
Sydney
until 1981.
Oh, but you came back to
Australia, yeah.
Came back to Australia, right?
And I went back to the States in 1981.
All right. So then, over the next course of your life, after that first trip in 1967,
67.
Don't
make me that old.
No, I won't do that. 1867. After your first trip in 1967,
yeah.
So you made how many more trips back?
I think 8.
8 trips.
Yeah.
Right. And so then, at this point, when did you actually begin in earnest really collecting books and artifacts?
The books in 1952 and the artifacts in 1957.
Right. So what was your... So you were already collecting before you went over the first time, but I got to imagine when you came back, that just made you all the more determined.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
Because we didn't have the internet.
Right.
You had to rely on catalogues, and I had to find out dealers in the United States and write to them for their catalogues. That's the only way I could do it. And it was slow and laborious and sometimes very, very unlucky.
So in the 1960s, if you want to buy something that you've seen, if you want to buy something from the United States,
yes.
Civil War artifact, yes. What do you have to do?
Well, you'd write to the dealer.
Right.
And they'd send you out a catalogue, which they did in those days.
And that takes how long? About
3 weeks, air mail. And you'd go through the listing and say like that. You'd send it back with the letter, and then it'd take 3 weeks to get there, and then 3 weeks to get his reply, which said, item sold, this is yours, that's sold. Slow, laborious, and then you had to go and get a bank draft and send it over and wait till they received it before they'd send the goodies on to you.
Right. And so, but you're doing this on a salary of something like...
Oh, a tradesman's salary, yeah.
Yeah. So this is, because you said it was almost impossible to make a phone call. It was so expensive.
In 1957, to make a phone call to the United States cost £12 for 3 minutes. And I was earning £20 a week tradesman's money, less £2 tax. So £12 out of the 18 is a big slice of your wages. And
then if you make the phone call and the person hangs up on you,
look, it was frustrating. I'd ring Gordon Jones's whatever, and they'd say, I'm sorry, he's on the phone, he'll ring you back, and they'd hang up, and there went your £12.
Yeah.
Or you would wait. He's with a customer, he'll be with you shortly, and you're waiting, and the switch girl would say, your time has expired, do you want to extend? No, thank you. And you'd hang up, and your money'd gone down the drain.
Right. Right. So by the time you get, so let's say it's about in the early 1970s, and you're really collecting in earnest.
Yeah. Same thing. No internet.
Yeah.
No credit card that you can instantly give the payment.
Right.
And they never send it until they got the payment, of course, naturally.
So what were some of your first and most memorable items that you...
I think the frock coat, officer's frock coat.
Officer's frock coat. Which one was that now?
Lieutenant one.
Okay, the federal lieutenant.
Federal lieutenant, yes.
And where did that one come from?
I think it came from Jack Jabez from New York.
Okay.
It cost me $175, and I was earning $50 a week.
Right. But you got to know all the big dealers.
Oh yes, I was getting probably 30 catalogues a year.
So who are the big guys back at that time?
Dale Anderson, Norm Fladerman, Jack Jacobson, quite a few others.
Right. Did you find any of them to be easier to work with, or maybe a little shady?
Some of them, excuse me, most of them were very good, very good.
Then they got to know you by name, I'll bet.
Oh yes.
Yeah, here comes that Australian.
But I learned something. They didn't like you sending stuff back. Because it didn't match the description or it was wrong, and they'd send it back. And I visited them when I was over there, and I saw firsthand what they had. And I remember one of them saying, I can't argue with you, you've got a better reference library than what I have. And I said, it should be the other way around. You should have a better reference library than I have because you're in the business.
Right. But now you were also able to find some things in Australia.
Yes, I did. Found up some muskets, a rather rare one actually. I believe it was rare. I heard there was well, you better get another chair. I heard that a friend of mine, contact of mine, there was a Civil War musket in Melbourne. He didn't know what it was like, what it was kind of. He said, but it's £25, which was more than what I was earning. So I took a risk and I bought it. And I went to pick it up and it was wrapped up in paper and I paid the money. And I'm coming home, walking through the city, and my excitement got too much for me. I couldn't wait. And I tore open the paper and I had a look at the hammer and my heart fell to my feet. It's not a Civil War musket. Oh my God, £25 down the drain. And I got home and unwrapped it, and it looked like nothing I'd ever seen before. And I thought, will I sell it? Try and get rid of it and recoup some money? And a little warning light said, don't sell it till you find out what it is. And it turned out to be that rather rare Whitney.
Right, so that was the 3-band so-called Whitney Enfield.
Yeah.
Were made in Massachusetts, or excuse me, made in Connecticut.
Yeah.
And a lot of those were actually sent south.
Yeah, they're made up of bits and pieces from Enfields and Springfields.
Right.
Yeah.
And so they kind of went south right before, and maybe even right after Fort Sumter.
Hostilities started.
Yeah. Whitney was a kind of greasy character, wasn't he?
Well, he must have been, because every Whitney I've seen had his name stamped in the lock plate. This one didn't. Because he didn't want to identify with himself selling the muskets south. That's my theory.
Right.
And that was one that I nearly rejected, and it's quite a rare one.
And this is the grandson of the inventor of the cotton gin.
Yeah.
So literally, what the cotton gin spawned,
Eli Whitney,
he took advantage of with his firearms. But then you also were able to obtain the Windsor. That was the Enfield that was actually made in America, and they ended up ended up here in Vermont. In Vermont.
Yeah.
And those ended up over here.
Yes, well, they were initially made for the British government for the Crimean War, contract of 16,000, I think. And the war finished and they cancelled the contract. And some they sent back because they said they were not up to standard. So they sold them at the outbreak of the Civil War, and they were issued to Vermont volunteers. And after the war, they were sold to surplus and came all around the world, and some came down here. And I had 4 of them at one time.
And I had never seen one when I saw yours.
Oh, really?
Yeah. 2007 was the first time I saw your collection, and that was the first time I'd ever seen one.
I had one of the so-called leading collectors here tell me it wasn't Civil War. And I said, what makes you say that? He said, it's made at Windsor Castle Armoury in England. And even me, I knew that they didn't have an armoury in Windsor Castle making muskets for the American Civil War.
Well, what were some of your other favorite things that you collected over the years?
Every item.
Why? And what was your objective in your collection?
Not to specialise, to spread it, that it had an example of every sort of field: medical, artillery, navy, correspondence, uniforms, musical instruments, medical instruments, the big picture.
The wide range of things.
Wide range, yes.
And it got to the point where you had so many artifacts that you needed a place to display them.
Oh, yeah, and I had to have a building and extend it out. I had 36 display cases holding some over 500 Civil War items.
And you built all that?
I built all the display cases, yes.
Right. Matter of fact, didn't you buy this house because it had an outbuilding?
Yeah, that helped.
Yeah, so you had an outbuilding.
Yeah,
So
a huge, big outbuilding that was suitable for what I wanted, yes.
For your
artifacts.
artifacts.
Much bigger than the garage.
Right.
Mm.
So
it was 45 feet by 22.
Right. Right. So did you have anything in that collection? What were the things that you were particularly proud of that were sort of one of the kind things?
Every item.
Okay.
Didn't matter how minor it was. It all went together to make the big pictures, like a piece of a jigsaw puzzle. It's just as equally as important as all the other pieces, but it might be the last one that fits the picture.
Right. Mm. Well, I was trying to get you to talk about the amorous adventures of Margaret Moncrief.
No, we won't mention that. But when you say, I had a tendency of fondness towards the uniforms.
Right.
Because they were so personal,
right.
I thought.
Right. And you had the complete uniform set with letters and a drum of a fellow in a Massachusetts regiment.
Yes, John Viles.
John Viles.
42 years of age, was a drummer in the, I think, 13th Massachusetts. And I missed out. I got the tunic, the hat, the drum sling, the drumsticks, and I think about 25 letters written by his wife to him. Mm-hmm. I missed out on his 3 wartime diaries, his discharge certificate, the cased image of him in uniform, and the 129 letters he had written to his wife.
Sometimes things got away.
Yeah.
But you still managed to accumulate what I think is probably the largest Civil War collection, or it was at the time, the largest American Civil War collection in Australia.
Well, that's not much of a claim because there's not many Civil War collections in Australia.
Fair enough. But now, so you're collecting artifacts.
Yes.
And then you're collecting books. And you're collecting, what kind of books are you collecting at this point?
Anything that related to the Civil War.
Like reference books?
Everything.
Regimental histories?
All of that.
Campaign histories?
Yep. Everything.
Bruce Catton?
Yeah. It didn't matter if it only had one page or one paragraph that filled a little niche in my collecting interest. It justified its position on the shelf.
And so here we are sitting in this library with 2,500 books.
Well, if I hadn't spent all that money on Civil War items and spent them on books, I'd have more than 2,500.
You still have the largest library of Civil War books.
I think there's a fellow in Melbourne might edge me out a bit. But he didn't spend his money on collections.
Right.
Yeah.
But then there was a third thing that you were doing through all of this too, which was making models.
Well, that was a hobby, yes.
Well, tell us about that.
Well, I always liked making models, even when I was a kid. And I got a fondness for Civil War artillery. And I decided I'd make a model Napoleon cannon. And I made that. And then I made the limber, so there's about 1,000 hours of work. And I thought, well, while I've made the cannon and the limber, why don't I make the gun detachment? And it started from that.
So you made...
I made the figurines, I made the uniforms, I made the boots, I made the equipment.
And you ended up making one thing that was very special. The wagon.
Oh, the wagon, yes.
And why was the wagon special?
Well, I thought it was the unsung hero of the Civil War, quite frankly.
Tell us about that. The 6-mule army wagon, U.S. 6-mule army wagon.
Yeah, model 8 in 58.
Right. Why is that the unsung hero, you think?
Well, they had railways that transported troops and equipment. They had the rivers, but they had to come from the wharf or the station to the troops in the field. And the only way they could do that was with the 6-mule army wagon. So it was the unsung hero, in my opinion.
And it turns out that it was also one of the rarest surviving pieces of equipment.
Which amazes me because they had thousands of them.
Where'd they all end up?
Oh, post-war.
Out west?
Destroyed during the war.
Right.
You know, the 800 were destroyed in Georgia at one time, all burnt, which I think some of them could have survived.
So you finished building your model wagon, and it was 1/6 scale,
yes,
right?
But I only had some limited plans. So I did a lot of correspondence to museums and individuals, and I even went to your establishment on 2 occasions so I could actually see one and know how they went together.
Right, because this is the other part of the story. This wagon is how you and I became friends.
Yep. Mm.
Tell me about that.
Well, I made the wagon.
Right.
Thanks to you allowing me to see it and measure it and photograph it.
Because the Atlanta History Center has one of the
original on display.
Only surviving Civil War six-mule army wagon.
Yeah, as soon as I heard that, well, that was the place I was going to visit.
Right.
And then I wrote to you originally, and I got some photographs and some information and encouragement. So it took 600 hours to build one of those. And I was quite happy with it. I'm never happy with the model that I make. Never been completely happy with it. And that's the way to be. Always strive for it better next time.
Mm-hmm. So
and then, when you saw the model, you said, would you make one for us? And my heart sunk. I thought, oh my God, 600 hours of work again. And then you said, we'll pay you for it, which inspired me somewhat. So I spent the next 2 years, 600 hours, building another one.
Well, what people have to understand here is that the six-mule army wagon that we have at the Atlanta History Center is still in the same condition as when it was finished at the end of the war.
That's how they came out of the workshop. That's how they looked.
Yeah, and so what we wanted, well, in other words, ours had been used and it had the history painted on it, and the color had changed over time, and it had been outside.
Yeah. And it showed its years of
wear.
Yeah.
So what we wanted was an example of what it looked like, as you said, when it came off the line.
Exactly, yes.
And it looked a little different from what people thought because of the color.
Yes, yeah.
And how did you figure that out?
Oh, good question. I did a lot of research on that. It says in the specifications to be painted a light blue colour. Well, what light blue to you could be dark blue to somebody else. And there was no standard colour at that time. And companies all over the United States were making them, and all they had was a light blue colour. So they'd mix up a light blue, and the next company might mix up a light blue, which is a little darker or a little lighter. And so I referred to original paintings at the time showing the wagon, and they were painted blue. And then the one that you have, we looked very carefully in the cracks where the weather hadn't gotten to it, and it was the light blue.
Right. Right. Because most people thought that, everything was olive green.
Oh, that didn't happen until 1900.
Exactly. Exactly. So that was, and then you finished that second wagon that you built for us.
Yes.
When was that? That was
2004.
2004.
Yeah.
And one of the things that impressed me most about that was that when you finished it, you packed it up in such a way and so carefully had you constructed the architecture of the package that you could ship it through regular baggage.
Yep, all lined with thick sponge rubber.
And it came out perfectly.
Didn't have a damage, did it?
Not a problem. But you threw in a little extra paint just in case if we needed to use it.
I had it in that box, big crate, on wheels, with a lead so that I didn't have to carry it. I could drag it through the airport.
Brilliant.
And when I went to put it in the customs, they came out and said it won't fit through our X-ray machine. We'll have to undo it. I said, well, you can undo it, but if you do, you damage it, or you don't put it back the way I've done it, I'm going to sue. So they tried to see whether it went through the X-ray machine, and it did.
I did not hear that story. Yeah. That's funny. So we now have your model wagon on display next to the original wagon.
Yeah.
And so in the process, then we began talking about your artifact collection.
Yeah, but we left out a bit.
Okay, let's talk about the wagon. Talk about the wagon. Okay.
So when it was finally finished, I contacted you and said, I finished, and you said, how much do we owe you? And I said, oh, Gordon, even if I charge you $10 an hour, that's 600 hours, that's $6,000. I couldn't ask you $6,000. And you said, well, how about if you bring it over, we'll pay for your airfare and your accommodation. So I took it over, and I was pretty apprehensive, wondering whether you'd be happy with it. And we went downstairs into the section, and I was wanting to have a cab waiting with the motor running in case they had to make a hasty exit. But thank goodness you were happy with it.
Oh yeah, we definitely were happy with it. Yeah. So we But then we really began talking, and at that point I had not been here.
No.
Had never seen your collection.
No.
But you invited me out in 2007.
I wanted to find a good home for it.
Ah.
And every collector should get rid of their collection while they got the marbles in their head to do it, and not leave it to their next of kin when they get called to God. Do it while you can. And I got rid of it, 13 years ago, 14 years ago, and I still miss it.
Of course.
Surprising. I used to go there every evening and go through it, rearrange things in the display case, and never tired of it.
And you had labels for every artifact?
Yeah, labels for everything, yeah.
Yeah. And only a select few were allowed to see it.
Oh, of course.
Because it's a security thing.
Yeah, and it was in darkness all the time, of course, except when I went at night time.
Yeah.
Keep it all correct and clean and neat and tidy and protect it.
Well, what impressed me about your collection was exactly what you just said was the purpose of the collection, because it was so broad and it touched on all these different aspects of the Civil War, and it actually filled in a number of gaps that were left, even with our Beverly DuBose collection and the Thomas Dickey collection that we had at the time. There were still some gaps in medical equipment and musical instruments, and there were just fun, interesting things that were in your collection that not many other people would have thought to have included in a Civil War collection. There were a lot of things about women.
Yes.
There were a lot of images. There were a lot of different...
Well, I had cases of images as well.
Cases and cases of images and newspapers and so forth. Plus, you also had a very large collection of the manuals, the Civil War manuals.
Yes, I like manuals.
Now, why were the manuals important?
Because they're sources of instruction.
Right.
As an ex-army man, we had manuals to teach us things that we needed to know on handling of weapons or drill or whatever, and it related the same back in the 1860s.
So they're your first-hand...
Yep, yeah, exactly.
The primary reference.
IDs in them of the people that had owned them, and I just thought, that's so nice. I'm reading the book that he was reading in the 1860s.
Exactly. Exactly. So those manuals were part of your collection.
Everything was part of my collection.
Well, you should be but we didn't at that time talk about your books. No. Your library.
And I thought, have it diversified, because you go to a collection that collects muskets and you just see walls over muskets, and after a while they all blend in, they look the same.
Right.
But I wanted things different. This case had musical instruments, this case had medical, this case had correspondence, letters from soldiers, letters from their next of kin. Another one had uniforms, this one had images, a little bit of everything. You
did, and that was the great thing about it.
And I got criticised because of that by some collectors.
There are very few general collectors. Most everybody, is in, just a specific type of sword or a specific type of this or that.
Well, I had swords too.
Yeah, you had a very general, broad, so that someone walking into your museum who knew nothing about the Civil War would have a very good overview.
I used to say, if somebody comes in there and they have no interest in the Civil War, there is something here that will appeal to them.
Right.
Whether it be nursing,
Yep.
the medical or the musical instruments, whatever.
You had the nurse's Bible, and she had collected the Lord's Prayer in 17 different languages in that Bible. I think that is one of the neatest artifacts I've ever seen.
It's quite nice, that wasn't it? It was ID'd as well.
It was ID'd, yeah. I was gonna also mention that you were very interested in the social history of the soldier.
Yes.
So you're interested in how soldiers lived.
Yes.
And
worked and played.
Right.
I even had a section of naughtiness.
Yes, tell me about that. We almost got you to talk about that a minute ago. Tell me about your novel. I'm going to say your novel there.
One of the dealers in New York had the catalogue set out to be, and there was this pornographic book listed. And pornography during the Civil War was pretty widespread. And I thought, well, that's an aspect of the Civil War that people don't want to know about or talk about. But it fills a niche. And I wrote over, and it was still available, and I paid a lot of money for it at the time. And my dealer said to me, "You have beaten some of the leading museums in this country to get that book because it's so rare." The Library of Congress, I was told, only had 3, and the Kinsey Institute had 2.
And I think it's called the Amorous Adventures of Margaret Moncrief, and it's published, of course, in New Orleans.
I haven't read it, Gordon.
Oh yeah, well, and it has illustrations, which
I
I haven't looked at.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that.
No, we don't. We know.
No.
Yeah, but no, it's part of the life at the time, and I think that's what's so incredible. Also, there was
so much of it was destroyed. This is a very, very rare survivor.
Exactly. And so at that point, then the Atlanta History Center was interested enough in your collection that we actually sent out an appraiser.
Yeah, I'm very grateful that they were interested because I wondered what I was going to do with it and where it would end up.
Right.
Because none of my family was interested. It would have ended up in a skip. And I thought, well, I'd like it to go somewhere where it's appreciated and other people can see it. Not only for this generation, but for generations to come.
Well, we appreciate it.
Well, I couldn't send the muskets over. Most of those went here because of the limitations, as you know, and a few other things which you didn't need because you already have them.
Right.
But I'm very grateful the Atlanta History Center took them. And they had the expense of sending out an appraiser who was here for a week, documenting it and giving a value on it, and I was very grateful.
Jack Melton.
Yes.
Jack Melton, who runs the Civil War News now.
And the best man in the business.
Yep. He came out and did the work for us.
Did.
And then there was the spectacular effort, because I made another trip over just to help dismantle the room, and it was kind of sad to see that happen.
Fall apart, but it had to be done.
But it had to be done.
But what I liked when you first came out, you didn't know what to expect.
Right. That's true. I did not. Because most people in the United States would look at this and go, why would somebody in Australia be interested in the Civil War?
And I say, why not?
Why not?
It doesn't belong to America, it belongs to the world.
Yeah, tell me about that.
Well, 24% of the soldiers that fought were foreign-born.
Right. So,
and it caused disruption around the world.
And
there's fought on the 7 seas of the world. It was politically ramifications from England and France and other countries. Belongs to the world, not only to America.
And there was a direct connection with Australia with the...
the Shenandoah came
CSS
here,
Shenandoah.
But that's not the only connection.
Right. And all the veterans who came to Australia.
Yeah, and then, of course, it galvanised our state militias.
That's right. Yes, that's right.
And it started our cotton industry here in Australia.
And there were Australians who went over to...
Yes. Technically, they weren't Australians because we weren't a nation. Then they were still from the colonies.
Right. Right. But I guess the thing I always like to say is if you want to know why the American Civil War is important, just imagine what would have happened had it turned out differently. What would the world look like today?
Well, quite frankly, if you hadn't had the Revolution, you wouldn't have had the Civil War.
Right, that's true. So are you saying that we Americans screwed that one up?
Well, that's your words, not mine.
Right.
You wouldn't have the War of 1812 either.
That's true. That's true.
Because England got rid of slavery in 1820.
That's it. It would have been a whole different trajectory.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And all those lives would have been saved.
And we would never have
700,000 people might have lived a full and satisfying life.
That's right. That's right. I mean, to me, there's still something just inordinately just fascinating about this whole concept of countrymen finding countrymen over
My father said
ideal.
That to me. My father. He said, I can't understand why Americans would want to kill Americans.
Right.
Over a triviality.
Well,
Lincoln wanted to buy the slaves free, and it would have cost far less buying their freedom than it was for the war.
Good point.
Yeah, the expense and the heartache and the destruction.
Yeah.
Beautiful cities destroyed, families disrupted, social life shattered.
But also 4 million Americans liberated, made free.
4.5, yeah.
4.5 million. So again, imagine if the thing had turned out differently.
Yes, I think Lincoln and the Tsar of Russia were 2 people that freed slaves.
That's right. Because 1861.
Yeah.
the serfs.
It's a terrible situation, slavery. Terrible system. Nothing to admire about it.
And those artifacts are particularly hard to come by.
Yes.
But you do have a number of books in your library, though.
On the slave, I've got a shelf load over
Shelf load of those. And more interesting books in your library, to me, are the official congressional inquiry reports on the treatment of federal prisoners
from Andersonville.
And
I visited Andersonville twice.
Which is in Georgia.
Yes.
And also about the Fort Pillow Massacre.
Yes, April the 12th, 1864.
Yeah. And so those two incidents, which triggered so much animosity after the war. And here are the documents. Here are the reports. This is the original stuff that you could put your hands on.
Yeah, and that animosity still continues today.
Yes, it does.
To a degree.
Yeah.
I remember in 1967, I was invited to a house in Virginia of a well-known Virginian family. Cold, wet, rainy night, and as I went in the front door with the host, there was a tall fellow in a grey jacket and grey trousers, and he said to the host, "Good evening, sir." And I thought he must be the servant, so I gave him my hat and coat, and he looked at me and hung it up, and I thought, what a cranky bugger you are for a servant. And it turned out to be the host's son-in-law, but that's another story.
Oh.
And at the dinner table, we were talking about my visit and what I'd seen and how I enjoyed up north, and a voice came from somewhere, nobody could enjoy living amongst the Yankees. And that was 1967.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's still there. I found it in later visits too. It's a little bit of resentment.
Yeah, lots changed in your lifetime, though.
Oh, yeah.
From that. But you, along the way now, in all these visits that you made to the United States, you met a lot of the leading lights. I mean,
I did. And then, of course,
I joined
the company of military historians. That's an open sesame because you meet all these people who are museum curators, authors, artists, historians.
And they made you a fellow.
Yeah, they made me a fellow in 2006, and I've been a member now for 52 years.
Right.
I'm one of the longest serving members.
And you met Bill Albach. You went to his house.
Bill Albach, met a lot of the leading lights over there.
And let's see.
Josie Bowes, of course.
Voda Bowes and
Harold Peterson.
Yeah. And then Park Service at
in Washington.
In Washington, right.
Organised the government car and a driver to take me around showing me the sites of Civil War forts.
That's crazy. Yeah, that's crazy. And when you tell the story about going to Ford's Theater, and you got this, that's where you...
Well, the chauffeur said to me, "I'd like to take you to Ford's Theatre and see the renovations and what's going on, but the foreman is very touchy. He doesn't like visitors. Understandable, because they're an interruption." He said, "Well, try it." He said he's very, very prickly himself. Turned out he heard I was an Australian and I got the red carpet treatment. He took me all over the place and even issued me the beautiful big booklet they had on the renovations and signed it with a nice little inscription.
And you have that book?
Oh, it's over there somewhere, yeah.
A lot of your books are signed by the authors.
A lot of them, yes. Which I like. Some people don't.
Yeah.
But I like.
Well, sometimes I think even, just those signatures of those leading lights, historians.
Well, I used to correspond with Bruce Catton.
Right.
And U.S. Grant III.
Yep, and you have a letter from him.
Yes, I have letters from him. I've got letters from the others and all the leading authors. Look, I wrote to them, and I've got their letters all in the books, which might help future students.
Indeed. Well, and you also have a letter from Basil Rathbone.
Oh, that's a different story altogether.
Well, let's hear that one.
Well, they may not know who Basil Rathbone is.
Oh, we better tell them.
British actor, a star in the 1930s and 40s. World War I soldier, won the Military Cross.
And a good swordsman. And a good swordsman.
Yes, well, we see him in films, like in The Mark of Zorro and Robin Hood. And I wrote to him because I could see he was a trained swordsman. And I wrote to him, "Where did you learn?" And he wrote that letter back.
That's crazy.
Explained it to me.
What a guy.
I would like to have met him, but he died 3 weeks before I got there.
But you have the letter framed.
I have
it's
the letter framed.
Sitting right over here. Yeah. So, the Atlanta History Center ended up with probably the biggest
Bulk of my
portion,
collection,
bulk
yes.
of your collection. There were a few
I hope
duplicate
you're happy
items.
with it.
Absolutely.
Because I'm not taking it back.
Yeah, good, because I'm not giving it back.
Oh, glad to hear it.
So we were able to make great use of that.
Look, if I may interrupt, I'm so grateful that you people accepted it.
Oh.
I really am.
Well, we're so grateful for the work that you put into it, because you faced in Australia all sorts of difficulties that
Extremely difficult.
that American collectors just don't know.
Yeah, little things like you send the payment over, a bank draft to the dealer for the item, and his bank charges him as much as the check's worth to clear it.
Right.
I had that.
It's the tyranny of distance.
Yeah, well, a bank draft sent over in American dollars, and they wouldn't accept that they made him pay as much as the check was worth to clear it.
Yeah.
And then I had to pay it again. Didn't have to, but I did.
And, for the modern audience, the biggest difference is that you were buying things sight unseen.
Yep.
Because there's no internet to have the
The
picture on it.
descriptions always weren't correct.
That's right.
Yeah.
So you ended up with some bad stuff?
Oh, yeah, we all do.
We all do.
We've all been caught.
Yeah.
Even the best ones have been caught.
Right.
But I not only had to pay for the item, I also had to pay for the postage.
Right. But for any of the items that you got that turned out to be wrong, though, that's a lesson.
Oh, yes.
And you learn, and that's one of the ways that you learn, right?
Yeah, exactly. We learn by our mistakes.
Exactly.
And quite frankly, a lot of the dealers didn't know what they were selling either.
Probably right. Yeah.
I don't say that to be insulting to them, but they didn't know.
Well,
because they can't know everything. They can't be an expert on swords. They can't be an expert on uniforms. If they've been at it for a long time, they've got a good knowledge. But there were those, like that chaplet scope, remember?
Yep. Right. We didn't find out until later that it was post-war.
1912.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But you at one point, because one of the dealers said, well, your reference library is better than mine.
That's what he said. And I said to him, it should be the other way around. You're selling the stuff. Your reference library should be better than mine.
Yeah. Well, a great deal of your library is what I would call just the reference books on the artifacts. So the reference books on the guns,
nearly 400 books.
Lord's Encyclopedia.
Yeah, we've got nearly 400 books on arms, uniforms, and equipment. And you need that.
You do.
If you're buying and collecting, you need to know what you're buying.
And the great majority of the authors of these books, well, not the great majority, virtually all, are private collectors.
Yep. Most of them.
Yep.
Mm.
Very few books published by museums these days.
Look at yourself. You've done that beautiful book on Gray's collection.
We have that one.
Yeah.
But most of these, this is a result of private collecting.
Without giving you false praise, Gordon, I admire people like yourself and authors of these books who have spent years doing research and writing these books to give me and other collectors the information we need to know. Because otherwise, where do you learn it?
Well, and then it works vice versa, because we get the information we didn't know from you. Well, because you've had the experience, you've had the artifact in your hand.
Yeah.
You've had to do the research of a particular item that I would never have had time.
6-mule army wagon.
Yeah, I would never have had time to do that.
Well, give it a job.
That's the thing. Yeah. Well, you had a job too.
Yeah.
So you're doing all of this and still supporting yourself and your family.
See, not only that, to get the books from the authors, and then when the company military historians, you get to meet the people that actually write these books.
Right.
And you're sitting having lunch or breakfast, and they're on the opposite side of the table to you, and it's a wonderful experience for me.
So you've built a library of at least 2,500 volumes here.
Yes. Yeah.
What's going to happen to that library?
Well, I hope that the History Centre will take it, and looks like that they will, because who do I give it here? Some reason Civil War enthusiasts out here don't buy books, or very rarely.
Right.
Yeah.
And
you must have books. If you don't have books, you don't learn.
And there's a number of these books that we simply do not have in our library.
Yeah, that's nice to know.
It is. It's true.
And the next thing to having the books is to actually tread the ground.
Ah, right.
You can read the books, you can look at the maps, you can look at the photographs, but it's not the same as being there.
Right.
In my opinion, anyhow.
Right. Well, so Len, let me ask.
I'm not drunk. It's just this chair.
Of course, it's just the chair. Yeah, I'm in a straight back, and it's a little bit easier. But
so you must be the producer's favourite, then, are you?
Well,
gave you the better chair.
Well, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Of course. I think one of the things that we've talked about that bothers us is, what happens when this generation dies off? What happens to that interest in history and in the American Civil War?
Well, we hope that it bursts forth anew.
Have you seen? Well, what's your feeling on that? What do you think's going to happen?
Well, you go to the company of military meetings, company of military historians meetings. How many young people do you see there?
Right.
Or you go to historical societies to talk. How many young people do you see there? None. I spoke to a local historical society late last year. Nobody there was under 50.
Right. Well,
let's hope they catch the bug like I did. It becomes infectious.
Well, I can assure you that there are some kids that do.
Yeah.
There are some kids that come along that will catch the bug, and they won't necessarily look like us, because we're living in much more diverse societies than we ever did before, and
they've got other distractions.
And they have other distractions, but I still think that there are enough young people from whatever national origin it might be that will find history interesting.
Even if it's only 1 in 1,000.
Even if it's only 1 in 1,000, there's that kid that's out there. He's going to be the next Len Traynor.
Oh, God help him.
No. But I think, and the other thing is, I wanted to say, okay, why is it important to study the Civil War?
Well, not only the Civil War, other wars.
Right.
Keep history alive. Well, I've been asked many times, why the Civil War? Why? What's the difference between that to any other war?
Right.
And it's a colourful one.
Yes.
In many ways. Even though we take into consideration the destruction and the loss of life, there's some fascinating aspects of it. Fascinating.
And it's also one of the most world-changing events.
One of the first most photographed war, too.
Oh, that's right. That's true. That's true, too.
Yeah. And that's one reason why there's so much interest, because there's photographs, there's images.
That's true.
I don't think it'd attract as much interest if there weren't images.
That's a good point. The first
more people studied the Civil War than they do the American Revolution.
Right. That's probably right.
And I'm sure that's just as interesting as the Civil War.
Right.
But I don't forgive you people being rebels against the crown.
That's all right. Yeah, well, yeah, but you know where the rebellion against the crown really succeeded in South Carolina. It was because of South Carolina that we won the war. You know that, right?
Yeah, well, I won't argue that.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. That's well, we are extremely grateful. Len, what else do we want to say about your life? What would you like to say to somebody who's looking at this thing from 30 years in the future? What's important?
Don't be discouraged by opposition.
Okay.
Because I got a lot of opposition. I got opposition from my mother. I got opposition from my first wife. I got opposition from my daughter. I get opposition from workmates who got angry. Why do you want to sit there and read a book for? You think you're better than us because you read a book? And when I won on the quiz, I got more resentment than praise.
So you had reason to be discouraged.
I kept going. Yeah.
Why did you keep going? What was it? What was inside you that made you keep going?
To prove that I was right.
There you go.
Like the fencing, I was discouraged. You're too short. You come from the wrong side of the city. You're a tradesman. You don't fit in. I got told that often.
Right.
But I answered not with words, but with my blade.
That's right. And with your actions to build this.
Yeah.
To build all of this.
Yeah.
But when you go to a battlefield.
Yes.
I mean, do you still feel emotion? Do you feel that emotion, that gut punch?
I feel
inside?
the unnecessary lives that were lost.
Yeah. You feel the tragedy.
Well, it's like World War II and the bombings. All the beautiful buildings destroyed, all the beautiful contents, the furniture, the paintings. For what? I went to Germany to visit my uncle's grave. He was killed during the war, and acres and acres of white headstones, and you think, for what?
Mm.
You could do without it, not necessary. And I'm not a pacifist, but I just think it's unnecessary for sometimes.
Yeah. What do you? Was the Civil War a necessary war?
It could have been avoided.
I'm not sure I see how.
Buying all the slaves free.
True that.
Setting them free. Compensating the owners.
As Britain did.
Mm.
Yeah. But by the time we get to the 1850s, was that really even possible?
Well, you know how much the war costs.
How much?
Well, at the beginning, it was costing $2 million a day, which wasn't petty cash in 1861. That's why the Salmon Chase, the Treasurer, introduced all those taxes to pay for the cost of the war, which was to be a temporary measure, but they're still the main source of income for the United States government today. Mm. Just as well he never made them permanent. Mm.
Yeah. Mm. So what you're saying is that ultimately, if you had to, if you could be God and look back on this thing, that it would have been easier to have just had a
unnecessary tragedy,
a compensated emancipation, and without
that's what I thought.
Without that,
yeah. That's my opinion. I could be wrong.
Of course,
we can all be wrong. Disagree with me.
Of course, but that's what makes it fun, because the thing with the Civil War is it's this constant source of debate, because there's so many things that are still relevant to us today.
Well, I did read at one time it was correct that buy all the slaves freedom in the state of Maryland would have cost $600,000, which was a lot of money then, but the cost of waging the war was $1 million a day in the beginning.
Yeah.
So it could have been done. Nobody thought of that. If they did, it didn't get eventuated.
Yeah.
But then again, there was no Civil War. I wouldn't have had a study, would I? I wouldn't have had a library or a collection.
That's true. Yeah. That's true. Well then, having said all this about the war and the way that it went, who are your heroes? Who are the people in the war that you respect the most from your readings and study?
What politicians or
anybody?
Well, I like the nurses, of course, that suffered so much and worked so hard to alleviate the suffering. They deserve a lot of credit. And people that fought efficiently and effectively.
Right. So who were the...
Well, in the south, of course, my favourite is Bedford Forrest. And in the north, my favourite is John Logan.
John Logan?
Yep.
And why Logan?
He wasn't a professional soldier, and he rose to the top in his fields of interest: politics, army, veterans organisations, and Freemasonry.
Well, and then Nathan Bedford Forrest was not a professional soldier,
but
he was a slave dealer.
Yes, that's true. He joins the army as a private, and 4 years later he's a lieutenant general, so he's got something going for him.
Right.
Of the 17 lieutenant generals in the Confederate Army, 3 were not West Point graduates. Which says a lot for them.
So so those would be maybe your favorite, at least in terms of military terms.
Yeah. Just
military men.
Yeah.
All right, but then as far as maybe political leadership or civilian leadership, who rises to the top in your mind?
Next question.
Okay, nobody. Nobody.
Next question.
Yeah, I heard that. So what about Lincoln?
Move on.
All right, enough said.
Look, I'm not being unkind to Lincoln. Great leader. But if he hadn't been a president when the Civil War was on, I don't think anybody would remember him any more than other presidents.
He rose to the occasion.
Right man at the right time and the right place.
And Jeff Davis?
Next question.
Enough said. Well, you mentioned earlier the first thing off the top of your head when you talk about who you really admire in the war was the nurses. And that forms a big part of your library. That also formed a big part of your collection. Would there be any individuals there that you would like to name?
Clara Barton. Scores of them. I just couldn't sing without one individual.
Sure.
Scores of them. A lot of them did their work, and the religious nuns that worked hard and suffered and died. And
yeah, I know. I noticed you have one over here on Mother Bickerdike.
Yes, there's a few there on Civil War nurses.
She was in the Atlanta campaign. That's why That's why I mentioned that. What about what of the average soldier? Because so much of your collection and so many of your books are just about the tools of war, the everyday tour.
Look, Gordon, without interrupting, you can read about the battles from now until hell freezes over, but you're not going to change the result. But the tools of war are interesting, the logistics, how it affected families, how it affected social life.
And how the soldiers went about their jobs.
And it's left a scar on the nation's soul, which is still clearly visible today. And recent events in the United States prove that.
It's true. Yeah.
As they did, pulling down statues.
Yeah.
You can't rewrite history. And you can't sanitize it.
But there's no better time for a history education than right now because of that.
Yes, well, we hope that by learning from history, we might improve ourselves.
Len, you're looking back on a magnificent life of 85 years, collecting in the Civil War for 77 of those years, and looking at what all you've built up and what all you've left to the next generation. I can only express my and a collective our profound appreciation for what you have done.
Well, thank you, Gordon. And I'm grateful to you on 3 counts. You took my collection, you're taking my library, but above and beyond that, you're my friend.
Here's to you, mate.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.